You know, I often wonder if there's a special kind of cosmic lottery that selects certain individuals to become HOA presidents. Not the good kind, mind you, the kind that genuinely cares about maintaining a pleasant community. No, I'm talking about the ones who seem to view the position as a coronation, transforming their cul-de-sac into a personal fiefdom. I think I probably broke the world record for the most audacious demand ever received from such a monarch. Ever been told you have 48 hours to tear down a significant portion of your multi-million-dollar lakeside mansion, a home you'd painstakingly designed and poured years of your life into, or, and I quote, vacate the premises, and all this so the HOA could carve out a little public footpath to the lake through my living room? Yeah, that happened. Stick around, because this story isn't just wild, it's a masterclass in what happens when unchecked entitlement meets immovable legal reality. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because you genuinely won't believe the layers of absurdity we're about to peel back. My place, Serenity Point, was more than just a house. It was the culmination of a lifelong dream, nestled on a prime piece of lakeside property that had been in my family for generations. My grandfather, a shrewd man with a love for the land, had acquired a substantial parcel back when this area was mostly untamed woodland and shimmering water. I'd inherited it with a deep sense of stewardship, and after years in the demanding world of corporate finance, specifically dealing with complex asset management and long-term commercial leases, I was finally ready to build my sanctuary. The mansion itself was modern, expansive, designed to blend with the landscape, with huge glass walls offering panoramic views of the lake. It was private, secluded, and exactly what I wanted. The nearest development, a collection of rather uniform beige-sided houses calling itself Lakeside Harmony Estates, was set back a good quarter-mile, separated by a thick stand of mature trees that I'd ensured remained untouched. I barely knew they existed, and frankly, that was part of the appeal. Then came Brenda. Or more accurately, then came the official-looking letterhead of the Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association, signed by one Brenda Milligan, president. The first communication was innocuous enough, a polite, if somewhat officious, note about ensuring my construction debris, long gone by the way, as the house had been complete for nearly a year, wasn't impacting community aesthetics. I sent back an equally polite, though perhaps a tad cooler, note assuring her all construction was complete and my property was immaculate, with photographic evidence. I figured that was that. Oh, how naive I was. Brenda, you see, was not a woman easily deterred by facts, or, as it would turn out, legality. She was, from what I later gathered from hushed whispers and wary glances from other residents I occasionally passed on the main road, a force of nature in a polyester pantsuit. She drove a pearlescent white SUV, the kind that's just a little too big for suburban roads, always wore sunglasses that obscured half her face, and possessed a voice that could, I imagined, curdle milk at 50 paces. Her particular brand of authority seemed to stem from an unwavering belief in her own importance, a belief apparently shared by her board, a small group of equally self-important individuals. The escalation began subtly, then rapidly gained momentum, like a runaway lawnmower headed for a prize-winning petunia patch. There were murmurs, relayed to me by a nervous-looking handyman I'd hired for some routine maintenance, about a new community initiative being championed by President Brenda. This initiative, cloaked in vague terms like enhancing shared amenities and promoting lake access for all residents, sounded ominous. My property, you see, had the most direct and picturesque access to the lake. Lakeside Harmony Estates, despite its name, was set back from the water, with only a small marshy strip of communal land at one far end that was largely unusable. My handyman, a local chap named Gary, who'd seen his fair share of HOA shenanigans, warned me. Heard Brenda's got her sights set on your stretch of shoreline, Mr. Davies. Says it ain't fair one person has all that prime access. I thanked him, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. The audacity was breathtaking. Then the official letter arrived. Certified mail, of course, because nothing screams "we mean business" like a trip to the post office and an extra $5 for a signature. The letter, typed on that same ostentatious letterhead, was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive entitlement. It spoke of a recent HOA board vote, A unanimous decision, naturally, to develop a community pathway and recreational viewpoint along the lakeshore. And wouldn't you know it, the optimal route for this pathway, according to their self-commissioned feasibility study, which I suspected was drawn up on Brenda's dining room table with a ruler and a crayon, ran directly through my landscape gardens, necessitating the removal of a significant portion of my privacy wall and, if I was reading the crude map correctly, the corner of my guest wing. The letter concluded with the ultimatum. I had 48 hours to either provide written consent for this minor easement and agree to a demolition schedule for the obstructing structures, or, and this was the kicker, begin proceedings to vacate the premises due to non-compliance with overriding community development covenants designed for the benefit of all Lakeside Harmony Estates homeowners. They were, in essence, trying to evict me from my own multi-million-dollar home on land my family had owned for the better part of a century. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it left me momentarily speechless. Then, a different kind of emotion began to bubble up, not just anger, but a cold, calculating resolve. They wanted my land? My house? They wanted to dictate terms on property they had absolutely no claim to? President Brenda and her merry band of busybodies had just kicked a hornet's nest, but they clearly had no idea the hornets in this particular nest were armed with decades of experience in contract law and an almost pathological aversion to bullies. My initial shock morphed into a grim sort of amusement. This was going to be interesting. They truly had no idea who they were dealing with. The 48-hour deadline was, of course, laughably absurd. It wasn't a legal time frame for anything beyond perhaps returning a library book or regretting a late-night takeaway. My first instinct, the purely human one, was to march over to Brenda Milligan's beige box of a house and deliver a blistering lecture on property rights, common sense, and the sheer bloody nerve of her demand. But my professional training, honed over years of navigating complex negotiations and hostile takeovers in the financial world, kicked in. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford. Strategy was paramount. The first call I made was to Arthur Jenkins, my lawyer. Arthur was a semi-retired real estate litigator, sharp as a tack, with a demeanor so calm it could soothe a rabid badger. He listened patiently as I recounted the contents of the letter, the only sound on his end, the occasional thoughtful, When I finished, there was a pause. "Well, Marcus," he said, his voice dry as a good martini, "it appears your neighbors have ambitions significantly exceeding their legal purview, or possibly their IQ. Let's get a copy of that letter and their so-called feasibility study, and any documentation you have regarding the Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA. Fortunately, I'm a meticulous record keeper. My grandfather had been too. Every deed, every survey map, every piece of correspondence related to Serenity Point and the surrounding land was archived, both physically and digitally. While Arthur began his initial research into HOA law specific to our state, I delved into my family's extensive files. The Lakeside Harmony Estates development, I knew, was relatively recent, built in the late 90s. My grandfather had leased a large tract of his land, the parcel behind what would become my Serenity Point, to a development company called Prestige Community Developers, Inc. This was a long-term ground lease, a common arrangement where the developer builds and manages properties on land they don't own, paying rent to the landowner. The individual homes in Lakeside Harmony Estates were then, presumably, sold or leased by Prestige to their current occupants. The question was, what did those agreements say? And more importantly, what did the master lease between my family and Prestige Community Developers stipulate? Getting my hands on the HOA's formation documents and bylaws proved to be the first minor hurdle. A polite email request to the generic HOA address, likely monitored by Brenda herself or her secretary, a nervous-looking woman named Carol, whom I'd seen once at the local grocery store, initially went unanswered. A follow-up, slightly more insistent, yielded a curt reply stating that such documents were available to homeowners in good standing, and I should consult my welcome packet. Since I wasn't a homeowner in their association, this was clearly a brush-off. Arthur, however, had more direct methods. A sharply worded letter from his office to the HOA's registered agent, citing state statutes regarding access to HOA records for affected parties, and I was certainly an affected party, did the trick. A thick manila envelope arrived a few days later, containing the Articles of Incorporation for the Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association, their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC, rupees, and their current bylaws. I spread the documents across my large study table, the scent of old paper and officialdom filling the air. Arthur joined me, and we spent the better part of a day poring over the dense legalese. It was in the fine print of the original master lease agreement between my grandfather and Prestige Community Developers, Inc. that we struck gold. Or rather, I struck gold as I recalled a specific set of clauses my grandfather had insisted upon, clauses I'd reviewed years ago when I first took over management of the family's property assets. He'd been a visionary, anticipating potential future conflicts with a clarity that now seemed almost prophetic. The master lease, a document running to nearly 100 pages, was ironclad. It detailed exactly what Prestige could and could not do on the land. It specified that any association formed by residents of the development would be subservient to the terms of this master lease. And then, the real kicker. Clause 37. B. Subsection 2. The lessee, Prestige Community Developers, Inc., shall be responsible for ensuring that all sublessees, tenants, and their associations conduct themselves in a manner that does not interfere with, harass, or otherwise impinge upon the lessors, that's me, as heir, peaceful enjoyment of their retained ancestral lands, including specifically the parcel known as Serenity Point. It went on to detail remedies for breach, including substantial financial penalties, and, in cases of persistent and unrectified nuisance, potential termination of the entire master lease. But the true bombshell, the one that made Arthur actually chuckle, a rare occurrence, was found not in the HOA documents, but in the county land registry, cross-referenced with the master lease. I already knew I owned Serenity Point outright. What I hadn't fully appreciated, or rather had forgotten in the context of this specific fight, was the sheer extent of that original parcel leased to Prestige. As we cross-referenced the lot numbers and survey maps, the picture became astonishingly clear. The land upon which every single house in Lakeside Harmony Estates was built, the roads they drove on, the tiny patch of communal swamp they optimistically called their lake access, even the ground beneath Brenda Milligan's beige shrine to conformity. I owned it all. They were, in essence, tenants on my land. More precisely, they were subtenants of Prestige Community Developers who were, in turn, my primary tenant. This Homeowners Association, this group trying to dictate terms to me and seize part of my private estate, was composed entirely of tenants who, it seemed, had mistaken their rental agreements for deeds of ownership. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. President Brenda Milligan and her Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA were not just barking up the wrong tree, they were barking up a tree that I owned, and they were about to find out that the tree had a very big dog guarding it. Furthermore, a quick consultation of state statutes confirmed Arthur's initial suspicion. An HOA with the kind of powers Brenda was trying to wield, levying fines, demanding property alterations, initiating evictions, typically had to be an association of actual property owners, not tenants. Their entire structure, their very claim to authority over anything beyond organizing the annual potluck, was built on a foundation of sand. This wasn't just an overreach. It was a fundamental misrepresentation of their legal standing. The discovery that I was, effectively, the landlord of the entire Lakeside Harmony Estates was a game-changer. It shifted the power dynamic from me, versus an annoyingly persistent gnat, to me, versus a gnat that was unknowingly trying to bite the hand that, metaphorically speaking, owned the entire swamp it lived in. Arthur and I began to formulate a multi-pronged strategy. This wasn't just about stopping Brenda's absurd land grab. It was about ensuring this kind of nonsense never happened again. And, if I was being perfectly honest with myself, a small, cold part of me was looking forward to educating President Milligan on the finer points of property law and the concept of hubris. First, we needed to address the legality of the HOA itself. Arthur was confident that an association comprised solely of tenants or sublessees simply could not wield the statutory powers of a true homeowners association, particularly when it came to encumbering or making demands upon the actual fee-simple landowner, me. He began drafting a formal complaint to the State Department responsible for overseeing HOAs and community associations, outlining the misrepresentations and ultra-vires actions of the Lakeside Harmony Estates HOA. This would, at the very least, put them on notice and initiate an official investigation into their standing. Meanwhile, the 48-hour deadline stipulated in Brenda's pompous letter ticked by. I, of course, did absolutely nothing to comply. I didn't demolish my wall. I didn't offer up my guest wing for their footpath. I didn't vacate the premises. I simply continued to enjoy my morning coffee overlooking the lake, albeit with a slightly more sardonic smile than usual. I imagined Brenda, perched in her command center, probably her kitchen, amidst Tupperware and simmering resentment, growing increasingly agitated. Her pearlescent SUV was spotted driving slowly past my property line a few times, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside, though I had my suspicions. It felt like a remarkably unsophisticated form of surveillance. On the third day after the deadline expired, they made their move. It was late afternoon. I was in my study reviewing some market reports when I heard a commotion outside. Peeking through the blinds, I saw Brenda Milligan herself, flanked by two rather large, thuggish-looking men I didn't recognize, her enforcement committee, I presume. One was attempting to affix a garishly orange final notice of violation sticker to my stone gate pillar, while the other was filming the proceedings with his phone, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. Brenda stood a little way off, arms crossed, directing the operation like a low-budget film director. This was precisely the kind of amateur-hour theatrics I'd anticipated. What they didn't know was that my own security system, a discreet but comprehensive network of high-definition cameras, was recording their every move, every word, every smug expression. I let them finish their little performance, then calmly walked outside, my own phone recording. "Good afternoon, Ms. Milligan," I said, my voice even. "Having some trouble with that sticker? Perhaps you're unfamiliar with the concept of private property and criminal damage." Brenda sputtered, clearly not expecting a direct confrontation. "Mr. Davies, you are in clear violation. This is official HOA business." The two goons puffed out their chests. I simply smiled. "Official, you say? That's a very interesting interpretation. I suggest you and your associates remove yourselves from my property immediately before I call the sheriff to report trespassing and attempted vandalism." The mention of the sheriff seemed to deflate them slightly. After a bit more blustering from Brenda about consequences and further action, they retreated, casting resentful glares over their shoulders. The orange sticker, I noted with some satisfaction, had failed to adhere properly to the stone and was already peeling at the edges, a fitting metaphor for their entire endeavor. The next step was to engage with Prestige Community Developers, Inc., the actual leaseholder of the land under Lakeside Harmony Estates. Arthur drafted a meticulously worded letter. It wasn't aggressive, merely factual. It detailed the harassment I had endured from their subtenants association, the illegal demands made, the attempted trespass, and attached copies of Brenda's letter, photographs of the sticker incident, and a polite but firm reminder of Clause 37b, subsection EV, of their master lease agreement, the one about ensuring their tenants didn't harass me. The letter also highlighted the potential for substantial financial penalties and, crucially, hinted that such blatant disregard for the terms of the master lease could be considered a material breach, giving me grounds for terminating their 50-year lease on the entire development. That, I knew, would get their attention. Losing Lakeside Harmony Estates would be a catastrophic financial blow to Prestige. While waiting for Prestige to inevitably panic, Arthur and I re-examined the master lease for financial leverage, specifically for the tanks rent scenario that had sprung to mind as a fitting consequence. Arbitrarily multiplying rent isn't usually how these things work. However, my grandfather, bless his foresight, had included a very specific and rather draconian clause regarding breaches that threatened the peaceful enjoyment of his retained lands or brought the property into disrepute. Clause 42. C. Liquidated damages for persistent nuisance, stipulated that if the lessee, Prestige, failed to cure a significant breach related to tenant misconduct after being formally notified, a penalty equivalent to a full year's standard rent for the entire parcel could be immediately levied. Furthermore, it allowed for an emergency rent review and adjustment outside of the usual decennial review period if the fundamental nature of the leasehold was jeopardized by the lessee's failure to manage its operations or Subtenants. Given the current standard annual rent for that vast parcel, which was already substantial, an additional full year's worth as a penalty, plus the triggering of an immediate rent renegotiation under duress, could easily be framed as a massive increase. Perhaps not literally 10 times overnight, but certainly a crippling financial blow that would make their eyes water and provide me with immense leverage to dictate new, much stricter terms, including a significantly higher base rent going forward. The development company had, through its negligence in controlling Brenda, handed me the financial equivalent of a tactical nuke. The beauty of it was that this financial pain would inevitably be passed down from Prestige to the residents of Lakeside Harmony Estates, the very people whose HOA had initiated this farce. Their quest for my lakefront was about to get very, very expensive for them. The response from Prestige Community Developers Inc. was, as anticipated, swift and panicked. My lawyer, Arthur, received a call within 24 hours of them receiving our certified letter. Mr. Henderson, a senior vice president at Prestige, sounded like a man who had just seen his retirement fund go up in smoke. He was apologetic, horrified, and desperate to assure us that they had no knowledge of Miss Provi Milligan's rogue actions, and that they would take immediate and decisive steps to rectify the situation. He practically begged for a meeting. Arthur, in his calmest, most non-committal voice, agreed to a preliminary discussion, but made it clear that the clock was ticking on the breach of contract. The pressure was now squarely on Prestige to rein in Brenda and her HOA. I could almost hear the frantic phone calls burning up the lines between Prestige's corporate office and Brenda's beige house. Brenda, I suspected, was about to have a very bad day, courtesy of her own landlords. True to Mr. Henderson's panicked promise, things started happening. I received a formally worded letter of apology, not from Brenda, but from Prestige Community Developers. On behalf of the Lakeside Harmony Estates Residents Committee, they were already downplaying the HOA title. It assured me that all community pathway initiatives involving my property were immediately and permanently canceled. It also informed me that Miss Bythe Milligan had been counseled regarding appropriate neighborhood conduct. Counseled. That was an understatement, I was sure. However, Brenda, being Brenda, was clearly not one to go down without a fight, or at least without a final, ill-advised display of impotent fury. A notice appeared on the Lakeside Harmony Estates Community Bulletin Board, a photo of which was discreetly sent to me by Gary, my handyman, who was enjoying the unfolding drama immensely, announcing an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda: urgent discussion regarding external interference in community affairs and reaffirmation of residents' rights. She was going to try and rally her troops to paint herself as the victim and me as the villainous overlord. This, I realized, was the perfect opportunity. Arthur and I decided we would attend. Not to argue, not to plead, but to deliver the coup de grace in person in front of her entire audience. The emergency meeting was held in the somewhat depressing community clubhouse, a low-slung building with faded paint and a distinct aroma of stale coffee and desperation. Arthur and I arrived a few minutes after it was scheduled to start, timing our entrance for maximum effect. The room was packed, a sea of anxious and resentful faces. Brenda Milligan stood at a rickety lectern in full cry. She was wearing a particularly strident shade of fuchsia, her voice reaching near supersonic levels as she decried the underhanded tactics of wealthy landowners, trying to suppress the legitimate aspirations of hard-working families. She painted a Bosa time and 17 AZ of .A18 rock with the 8. Rock 17 varianta, right comment. Picture of herself as a brave Joan of Arc fighting for their right to a tiny sliver of my lakeside paradise. There were a few scattered, hesitant applause. She was clearly trying to whip them into a frenzy of righteous indignation. It was quite the performance. She didn't see us enter, her back was mostly to the door. When she finally paused for breath, a board member, a meek-looking man named Gerald, who always looked like he was apologizing for existing, spotted us. He tugged on Brenda's sleeve, whispering urgently. Brenda turned, her eyes widening slightly as she saw me and Arthur standing calmly at the back of the room. A flicker of something, surprise, fear, crossed her face before being replaced by a hardened glare. Well, well, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Look who decided to grace us with their presence, Mr. Davies. Come to explain why you think you're better than the rest of us. The room murmured, a low growl of agreement from her core supporters. I just smiled faintly. Arthur stepped forward. Ms. Milligan, members of the Lakeside Harmony Estates Residence Committee, he began, his voice calm but carrying easily through the suddenly silent room. My client, Mr. Davies, is not here to explain himself. He is here because there are a few fundamental truths you all seem to have overlooked, truths that have significant and immediate consequences for every single person in this room. Brenda scoffed. Truths? The only truth here is that he's trying to bully us. Arthur ignored her, turning to address the assembled residents. The first truth, he said, his tone becoming a shade more serious, is that Mr. Davies is not just another resident. He is, in fact, the fee simple owner of all the land upon which Lakeside Harmony Estates is built. Every house, every road, this very clubhouse, it's all on land owned by Mr. Police. Davies Family Trust. A collective gasp went through the room. Faces turned from confused to stunned. Brenda's jaw actually dropped. That's a lie, she stammered. It is a matter of public record, Miss Milligan, Arthur continued smoothly, which brings me to the second truth. You are not, in the traditional or legal sense, homeowners with the rights and powers you've been claiming. You are, in fact, sublessees. Your primary landlord is Prestige Community Developers, who in turn lease the land from my client. This Homeowners Association, as you call it, has no legal standing to make demands upon the actual landowner regarding his private property. Your attempts to coerce Mr. Closapayings and Soviet 1819-0 Davies into surrendering his land, your threats, your trespass, these actions are not just inappropriate, they are illegal. He paused, letting that sink in. The silence in the room was now thick with dawning horror. Furthermore, Arthur pressed on, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, your association, by misrepresenting itself and attempting to exercise powers it does not possess under state law, powers typically reserved for associations of actual property title holders, has likely violated several state statutes. A formal complaint has already been filed with the relevant state authorities to investigate these irregularities. More gasps. People were starting to look at Brenda not with support, but with dawning anger and fear. But perhaps the most immediate truth you need to understand, Arthur said, his voice dropping slightly, creating an even more intense focus, concerns Prestige Community Developers. Due to the harassment and attempted property interference orchestrated by this committee, specifically by Ms. Milligan, Prestige is now in material breach of its master lease agreement with Mr. Davies. This breach has triggered significant penalty clauses. He looked directly at Brenda, who was now pale and trembling. Specifically, a liquidated damages penalty equivalent to 1 full additional year's rent for the entire development parcel is now due and payable by Prestige. And, more critically for all of you, it has triggered an immediate rent review and adjustment for the master lease. He let that hang in the air for a moment. Mr. Davies has instructed me to inform Prestige that the new ongoing ground rent for the Lakeside Harmony Estates parcel, due to these egregious breaches and the clear failure of Prestige to manage its subtenants, will be increasing very, very substantially effective next billing cycle. An increase, I assure you, that Prestige Community Developers will have no choice but to pass directly on to each and every one of you in the form of significantly higher rents or site fees. The room erupted, not in support of Brenda, but in a cacophony of shocked outrage, fear, and recrimination, all directed at their now disgraced president. You did what? Someone yelled. Our rents are going up because of you? Shouted another. Brenda was speechless, her fuchsia outfit suddenly looking garish and absurd. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, looking utterly defeated. The Queen had been dethroned not by a rival, but by the simple, unassailable weight of legal fact and her own colossal arrogance. Arthur and I just stood there, watching the suburban meltdown. The show was even better than I'd anticipated. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was swift and, for some, brutal. The Lakeside Harmony Estates Homeowners Association, as a power-wielding entity, ceased to exist almost overnight. The state investigation Arthur had initiated quickly confirmed its improper constitution and overreach, leading to a formal order to dissolve or restructure into what it always should have been: a tenants' social committee with no actual authority beyond organizing barbecues and complaining about dog poop. Brenda Milligan's reign ended not with a bang, but with the quiet fizzle of her pearlescent white SUV being loaded onto a moving truck a few weeks later. Rumor had it that Prestige Community Developers, in a desperate bid to appease me and mitigate some of the financial damage, had strongly suggested her lease would not be renewed. I didn't inquire too closely. Her departure was satisfaction enough. The image of her, sunglasses askew, face a mask of bewildered fury as she was driven away from her beige castle for the last time, was a quiet victory. For Prestige Community Developers, the financial reckoning was significant. The penalty clause for a full year's rent stung them badly, and the renegotiated master lease, while not quite the tanks figure I'd initially fantasized about in a moment of pique, involved a very substantial increase in their annual ground rent. I was, after all, a businessman, and while I enjoyed the taste of victory, my primary goal was long-term stability and the quiet enjoyment of my property. The new lease included ironclad clauses regarding tenant conduct, oversight responsibilities for Prestige, and even stricter penalties for any future transgressions. As Arthur had predicted, Prestige had no choice but to pass these increased costs on to the residents of Lakeside Harmony Estates. Their rents and site fees saw a sharp, painful hike. The irony was not lost on anyone. Their collective attempt, spearheaded by Brenda to gain free access to my prime lakefront property, had resulted in them paying significantly more to live further away from it, with less disposable income to even think about lakeside recreation. Some residents, unable or unwilling to absorb the increased costs, eventually moved. The character of Lakeside Harmony Estates began to change, perhaps becoming a little quieter, a little more humble. A few of the more reasonable residents, those who had been quietly uncomfortable with Brenda's crusade but too intimidated to speak out, approached me individually in the following months. They offered apologies, expressed their embarrassment over the whole affair, and made tentative overtures towards a more neighborly coexistence. I accepted their apologies graciously. I had no quarrel with people who understood boundaries and respected property rights. In a gesture of, shall we say, calculated magnanimity, and also because a harmonious, if distant, relationship with the development was preferable to ongoing animosity, I eventually instructed Arthur to discuss a very limited, strictly controlled access agreement with Prestige. Not a public thoroughfare, heaven forbid, but a keycard-accessed gate at the far end of their existing, somewhat dilapidated communal area, leading to a small, designated section of shoreline well away from Serenity Point. It would be managed and maintained by Prestige, with clear rules and responsibilities. It cost them a bit more to develop and maintain, but it gave the remaining residents the lake access they craved, albeit entirely on my terms and reinforcing my ultimate authority over the land. It was a small price for them to pay for peace, and a useful reminder. Reflecting on the whole absurd episode, I was struck by the sheer audacity of entitlement. Brenda Milligan genuinely believed she had the right to disrupt my life, devalue my property, and essentially commandeer a piece of my ancestral land for her own petty vision of community. She, and those who blindly followed her, operated under the delusion that their desires superseded my rights. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the biggest bullies aren't found in corporate boardrooms or international arenas, but right next door, armed with nothing more than a misplaced sense of importance and a poorly understood set of bylaws. The stress had been considerable, yes, but the satisfaction of watching their entire edifice of arrogance crumble under the weight of meticulously researched facts and well-executed legal strategy was immense. It was a victory not just for me, but for anyone who's ever had to deal with an overzealous HOA or a neighbor who thinks community means what I want, you give. The primary lesson, one my grandfather had clearly understood, was the critical importance of knowing your rights, understanding your contracts, and never, ever underestimating the opponent, but also never letting them underestimate you. So that's how I ended up effectively owning the land under an entire HOA and delivering a rather expensive lesson in property law and humility. It turns out being the landlord has its perks, especially when your tenants get a little too big for their britches. What's the craziest HOA story you've ever encountered, or the most entitled neighbor you've had to deal with?